Welcome to the first of the year meeting of the Missoula Democratic Central Committee in a totally new political era, as it would seem. Happy you're all here, and we'll have an hour of Micah's presentation. Roberta will introduce her. There she is right in front of me. And then we'll have the business meeting. So, Roberta, thanks for coming, Micah. Roberta.
Oh. I just feel like I feel very honored to be introducing this amazing woman. She works with Montana Women Vote, and she does so much for our community. You have no idea how hard she works. Anyway, she's here tonight to tell us about Montanans Against Hate and the things that we can do to stand up against hate. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
like Roberta said, my name is Micah. I'm the program director at Montana Women Vote. We're part of the Montana Human Rights Network. Montana Women Vote exists to work alongside low-income women and families in the democratic process. Hi, Mary.
Hi.
And that looks different ways on different days depending upon the time of year and whether or not it's election cycle, and we can talk more about it later. But you should know that Montana Women Vote is part of the Montana Human Rights Network, and we are an organization that believes in intersectionality. We're going to talk more about that and what that looks like, particularly as Missoulians who have a tendency to value diversity in what we talk about, and we're going to talk about what diversity actually should be and ways that we can stand up for our neighbors. Before we start though, I think we're a small enough group, and I'm going to ask two things of you. The first thing that I'm going to ask is that you squish together a little bit more. Can we do that? Can we like shift and come together a little bit more?
That's
good.
Great. Thank you. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. The reason why I ask you to do that is because when we talk about bystander intervention, particularly a lot of us as white people, talking about bystander intervention can be really tough. It can be personally challenging. It can be challenging to communities. This may be a little bit more touchy-feely than the Democratic Central Committee is used to having, but it's an important conversation, and not just because of the political climate. This is an important conversation to have as community members, as individuals, as families, and as people who work in politics, regardless of political climate, because oppression exists regardless of who is president. That's the reality of it. I'll also give a disclaimer too that Montana Women Vote is nonpartisan. I'm here because Roberta asked me to be here. We do not support or endorse any one particular candidate or party, and I just wanted to say that so we have our disclaimer. If the Republican Party of Missoula asked me to come and give this presentation, I would, and I would happily do it. So now that we're all squished together, I also want to take some time to do something that may be new to some of you, and it's a little weird, but it's important to folks in my community. We're going to introduce ourselves with our first name and our gender pronoun. I'll go first. Gender pronoun is he, she, they, them, their, whatever you identify with. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So you can say, this is Micah's, or this is her presentation. So that's how I prefer to be referred to. I prefer female pronouns. So my name is Micah. I use she, her pronouns. You want to go for it?
Sure. I'm Klaus, and I use he, his, what's the other one?
Him.
Him.
Nailed it. Perfect.
With help.
I'm Roberta, and I use she, her, hers.
Yes. Nice job.
And Laura, I use she, her, hers.
You sound like an old pro.
I'm Sky, I use male pronouns.
I'm Mary. I'm not really sure, to tell you the truth.
That's fair.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
She, her, hers.
She, her, hers.
That's how you and I usually talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
She, her, hers.
Fellas?
Todd Mowbray, I'm the secretary. I use the full range of pronouns. When referring to myself, I use masculine.
Awesome.
Dustin Boone, I'm a teacher. He, him, his.
Awesome.
I'm Dave, he, him, his.
Great.
Sean, he, him, his.
Phil, he, him, his. Scott, he, him, his.
Thanks for participating, Scott.
I'm not participating.
Okay,
Rebecca, she, her and hers.
nailed it. Great,
Barb, he, she, her.
great,
Aaron, she, hers.
great,
Bo, male pronouns. Deborah, she, her, hers.
awesome.
Robin, she, her, ours.
Patrick, he, him, his.
Nailed it. Nice job.
Mary, she, her, hers.
Great,
I'm Ames, and I'm a she, her, hers.
great.
Brian, he is him.
I'm Liz, and I'm she, her, hers.
Awesome. Thank you for participating in that. I appreciate it. In my community, talking about gender pronouns is really important to a lot of folks. We're going to talk about microaggressions in a second, but being misgendered is a thing that people experience day in and day out. So as we're going to talk about bystander intervention and anti-oppression work, I think it's important to kind of set the tone by opening ourselves up and being willing to self-identify in a way that lots of other people have to do constantly. By saying she, her, hers, I recognize that it's a privilege to be able to say she, her, hers, and have you all know just by looking at me that that's how I identify. Lots of folks don't have that opportunity. A big part of bystander intervention and understanding oppression is recognizing the spots that we have privilege in, and gender is a huge privilege. Knowing that the body that you are in is the one that you identify the most with is a privilege. So thank you for participating in that with me. I know it's probably uncomfortable for some folks, so I appreciate it. So she, her, hers, I'm the program director at Montana Women Vote. Let's get started. There's a lot of words on this. And in order to set the tone for bystander intervention training, I just want to talk about oppression to start with. Can somebody define oppression for me without looking at this? That was misplanned on my part. Like, what's oppression? I feel like this is one of those things that we recognize it when we see it, but we don't often have words for it, you know? It's easy to see like somebody from the Ku Klux Klan being discriminatory and label it like that is oppression. But if you had to define oppression, what would you define it as?
Power squash.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really great way to say it. Power squash. The definition that we often use is the use of power to disempower and marginalize any social group. It's using a power that you have to silence someone else. This looks a couple different ways. We know policies that can be used to disempower people, right? Preventing people from voting is a really great example of this. That is disempowering. It is oppressive. But there's a lot of other things that are oppression, and we know them in our, society now by labels like racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia and ableism, stuff like that. Those are all oppressive things that people experience every day. Anti-oppression work, though, is what we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about tonight, in the time that we have. Working on anti-oppression seeks to overturn oppressive things that happen in our society. It attempts to mitigate the effects by equalizing power in between people. That's an important word. Why is equalizing power important? I think it's important because of tokenism. Does anybody know, can anybody just explain what tokenism is? So let's say that we're in a group like this, and everybody wants to be more diverse. We know what the word diverse is, right? There's a difference between opening yourself up to diversity and handing power over somebody with less privilege than you. That's what anti-oppression work is. It recognizes that in the space that we occupy right now, I have more privilege than this other person, and that opening ourselves up to the idea of diversity only goes halfway. That I need to share power with that person, that I need to share space intellectually with that person, and just having that person in the room is not enough in terms of achieving anti-oppression. Does that make sense? Okay. A good example of this is I served on a board for a while, and the reason that I was there was because I was an LGBTQ person on the board. That is not anti-oppressive. That is diversity. That is choosing to include people in the spaces that we're in, but not actually sharing power with folks. This is one of those things that is another one of those you recognize it when you see it kind of things. And a great example of it is when we experience feedback from marginalized communities. If in this organization, for example, someone came and said, I feel like we don't have enough space to talk about Native issues, or I feel like we're not making enough space to talk about ableism, would we or would we not be open to having that conversation and then changing in order to make sure that we are being actually inclusive and anti-oppressive in our
What's
work?
ableism?
Ableism is taking for granted the ability to, for example, the snow's outside. Not shoveling your sidewalk can be pretty ableist. Folks don't often have the ability to use sidewalks. They can be in wheelchairs, they can need other equipment in order to move around. Being anti-ableist would shovel your sidewalk, recognizing that there's a lot of folks that don't have the privilege to just walk over snowbanks when we have it. There's also, so everybody know about the Women's March that's happening? Okay, there's been a lot of conversation around the Women's March about whether or not the buses are handicap accessible, about whether or not the spaces that people are going to go and rally are handicap accessible, and whether or not the restrooms that folks will use once they get there are handicap accessible. Not thinking about those things beforehand can be ableist, and we can talk more about it later, but you know, that's what ableism is. Also, side note, if you have questions, please feel free to spit them out. This needs to be kind of a two-way conversation or it's super awkward. So that's where we're at. I also just kind of want to point out what microaggressions are. Does anybody know or like have a just like off the hand definition of what a microaggression is?
I'm sure I give them every day.
Maybe. Do you have an example of
I
it?
have a human, right?
Yes.
One of the issues I have with some education of this nature is that it presupposes that this virtuistic presentation is something that, is there somebody who lives this way all the time? Absolutely not. We all have bias and couched bigotry, things that we are not proud of, that exist within us. And I want to know how to rise above that.
That's what we're going to talk about. Thank you for saying that. I think that's one of the more difficult things about this too, is that it requires us to be introspective and honest with ourselves about those moments when we have participated in oppression, when we have participated in making other people feel small. That's what this is about. This is about opening our communities up and recognizing opportunities for us to include everyone in a real way, not in a transactional way that says, hey, you're here and that's good enough, in a way that actually allows us to approach issues and policy, which I'm sure this group spends a lot of time thinking about. It allows us to approach those kind of things knowing that the things that we're working on and that we're doing are actually representative of our communities. And it also challenges us to do the work that allows us to wear little safety pins and feel like we know what's going on when we're wearing a safety pin. Does that make sense? That's an analogy. We all know what the safety pin thing was, right? After He Who Must Not Be Named was won the nomination for president, there's a lot of folks that were saying we're going to wear safety pins as a sign of solidarity with folks, primarily people of color and trans folks. That's what it was for. There's a lot of criticism about safety pins though, and that goes back to whether or not we're being diverse or being anti-oppression. Whether or not we're practicing anti-oppression. It's one thing to wear a safety pin, and it's another thing to intervene when you see violence and oppression happening. And all of us, every single person in this room, we are all people that have given in to violence that's happening around us. We're all people that have sat by while something has happened to us, and it's really difficult to sit with that and learn from it. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. Because here's the thing, it's easy to see a KKK rally, it's easy to see a Nazi rally that's happening and point it out and say, I know that that is wrong. I absolutely know that that is wrong, and I would go and I would rally and I would say that this is not for me. It is another thing, though, to see a trans woman being harassed on the street and take time out and intervene on her behalf when that's happening. That's what we're talking about. It's another thing to hear your friend make a racist joke and say, hey, can we have a conversation about this? It asks us to risk something. It's not as big as showing up and rallying against a KKK rally. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? So that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. So bystander intervention is a tool that's used often in the prevention of sexual assault and domestic violence. It has since, in the last couple years especially, grown more to include a lot of other kind of things. And bystander intervention is primarily a strategy for interrupting moments of oppression. So that racist joke that your friend is saying, or those awkward moments at the Thanksgiving table when your dad doesn't understand why Black Lives Matter is an important thing. Those kind of things. That's what we're talking about. It requires personal accountability. It requires us to show up big for folks even when there's nobody watching us. It requires us to stand up and care about whether or not something oppressive is happening when other people aren't watching us, or when it's not, as blatant as a KKK rally, honestly. It's a personal response to oppression and violence by folks who have more power in the situation. Can I give you an embarrassing example of this? Do we have time for it? Okay, so I was in Portland this weekend at this great convening of folks. It's called the Western Institute of Leadership Development. It's part of Western State Center. And it's folks who are organizers across the 5-state region. There's folks, more than that. There's like 12 of us from Missouri and Washington and Oregon and Montana and Idaho and Wyoming. And we're coming together and we're talking about our shit, We're learning from each other. We're learning strategies. And before we went to the retreat center, I was standing in this corner store with a friend of mine named Hodan, who's Muslim. She wears a hijab, she wears long dresses, she's very visibly Muslim. She's also a refugee, or was a refugee, from Somalia, lived in a refugee camp in Kenya, and is doing amazing work in Seattle now with a group called Got Green. She's very visibly Muslim. When we were standing in this corner store, well, as we were walking into the corner store, this guy was walking out, and Hodan was on the phone, and I'm walking in right behind her, and he holds the door for us. She doesn't say anything to him because she's on the phone, right? And I say, thank you, and we keep going. Another friend comes in right behind us. Probably 5 minutes go by. It has been a long time since this guy had left the corner store. And all of a sudden, I'm standing there paying for my Gatorade or something like that, and I see him coming out of the corner of my eye, and he looks at Hodan, and he points at her and says, "You didn't say thank you to me when I held the door open for you." 5 minutes had gone by. This guy left the corner store and went down several blocks and then walked back with the explicit intention of singling her out and saying, "You didn't hold the door open for me." What did I do? I didn't say anything because I didn't really register what was happening. Another friend of mine intervened and said, "She doesn't owe you anything. You shouldn't be holding the door for people just because you expect a thank you. You should hold the door for people because it's the right thing to do," right? I can get behind that. But as I'm standing there paying for my stuff and I'm hearing this interaction happen over here, I didn't say anything. And I screwed up. I was the only white person there that could have said, "This is Islamophobia. You're being patriarchal. This is not okay." And I didn't say anything. So as we go through this and we talk about it, there's a lot of opportunities for all of us to learn, and it also requires us to recognize ways that we have given into it. We're going to talk about interrupting those things, because those are going to be the kind of moments that people really need us to show up and step up for. People remember when they're alone in those situations. People remember when they're being called a homophobic slur and nobody around them had the courage to stand up and say, "I think that's wrong." And it's hard and it costs something, but we're going to work through it. So I have a couple examples of this that I want us to kind of work through and brainstorm ways that we could intervene. So let's say you're on a bus and there is a woman like Hodan who's wearing a hijab sitting on the bus, and a guy, kind of like what happened on that air flight recently, singles her out and starts yelling at her and calling her Islamophobic terms and racial slurs, and you're sitting there and you don't know either of them, and you're just kind of witnessing it. What are a couple ways that you can intervene in that situation that would stop that from happening, and also to make sure that that person knew that you didn't think it was okay?
Say, "Hey, that's not cool."
Yeah, say something. What's up, Mouse?
You could kind of step into it a little bit. Stand next to the person so they don't appear alone and feel less alone.
I love that example. A friend did this for me once, and it was one of the best ways that somebody's ever come to my rescue before. And I know that we don't need people to come to our rescue, right? That's problematic, but whatever. They came to my rescue and I was super grateful for it. And they stood between me and that person. They like physically moved their body in between mine and this person that was harassing me. And I was very, very appreciative of it. That's bystander intervention. Like standing up and saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong, or physically putting yourself in the space between that person and the other person who's yelling at them. That's bystander intervention. Yeah.
I've read about people also going up and saying, you know, even though you don't know her name, you pretend you do, you know, and you just say, hi, oh, Michelle, I didn't see you when I came on the bus.
Yeah.
And, I mean, what is that? Does that help?
It's great. There's a couple friends in Wyoming who do organizing that are doing trainings like that on how to have those conversations. I wish we had a little more time to like, excuse me?
It's hard to be calm in situations like that. For me,
Yeah.
I would do the standing in between, and I would make, because I actually do trainings on bystander intervention. So
Oh, do you?
at the school to prevent sexual assault. So
Cool.
my strategy would be, I would just stand in between them, and I would give him, her, they, whoever, I would give them unbelievably awkward eye contact. That would let them know that that's not okay. Then they would want to verbalize, like, what are you doing? Well, then we would engage in conversation, and I would let them know that that's not cool. But that's
So you don't just like say like I'm giving you really uncomfortable eye contact?
No, I would.
You don't just leave it there?
Just
teasing.
Stare at them and just eye contact when they move. I would just go with them, just shadow them, and then.
That's a really great tool and a good way to do it.
So I have a comment about that.
Sure.
It's like the scenario is going to always be different, just so to have those tools in your toolbox are really important.
Yeah.
For example, if somebody is aggressive, you're not going to go and, I wouldn't go stand in front of them.
I wouldn't either.
But I would certainly say, oh, hi, it's been a long time since I've seen you. I mean,
Yes.
that's a really easy thing for me to do.
Yeah, and to your question, that's a tool that a lot of people have used in particularly aggressive situations, and sitting down and pretending like you know the person and just having a conversation with them, asking them really simple things is a really great way to intervene. The other thing about that too is that it takes the focus off of the person who's clearly begging for attention. You know, like in those moments, it's often just as much about the person who's being harassing as it is about the person who is being harassed. So removing the focus from them and turning it on this person who's a human being who's clearly experiencing something that is like really traumatic is a really, really kind way to interrupt in those situations. The other thing about it too is that it doesn't force you to have all of the right words in the right moment. That's kind of why, for me at least, it's always helpful to go through these scenarios, because clearly I'm not good about this all of the time. Nobody is. But going through scenarios and like talking it out and saying, well, what would you do, sort of helps you. And if you just don't know what to say, hanging out and spending time with that person instead of like engaging with whatever this person over here is doing is a really great tool to have. So let's say that you're in a meeting. Okay, you're in a meeting and it's a lot of guys and there's one woman there, and all of the guys are having a conversation and nobody is actually addressing this person right there. They're not making eye contact with her. They're not including her in the conversation. They're not actually even like acknowledging that she's in the room. Do we all understand why that's oppressive?
Of course.
Are we all on the same page about that? I think this election is a really great example of how that happens in debates. But let's say that you're one of the people that's in that meeting. How do you address that
Or you
in a
just
meeting?
turn to her and saying, hey, Joanne, what do you think about that?
It's great.
I've done it a million times.
What else could you do? Yeah.
Maybe this is my male privilege right now, but I'm way more, as far as I like to highlight things to my male counterparts, so, and hold them accountable. So I say, excuse me, gentlemen, we're excluding someone in the room, and we're being very, very sexist right now, so we include this individual in the conversation, and things like that. I'm way more of making it accountable on them, like, hey, this is what we're doing, it's not.
Yeah,
Well, it
I
depends
really
on the
appreciate
meeting.
it when people do stuff
But
like
that
that.
depends on the meeting,
Right.
Bill?
You can position yourself here by that person, and you're including them in the group, so to speak.
Especially if you're a person in power, like if you're the chairman or whatever, and you're sitting next to this individual, everybody has to look in your direction, so they have to.
Yeah. Those are all really great strategies. It's like you have experienced this before or something. I feel like in the last two ones that we've noticed, body language has kind of been a recurring theme. Like sometimes if you don't know exactly what to say, that like positioning yourself or thinking about where you're sitting is a really great way to subtly intervene. Also in situations like this has also happened to me before, it can be really embarrassing to be the person in the room who's being ignored. And calling it out has been like great in some circumstances, and it's been like really embarrassing in others. So sometimes like asking questions and calling it out and moving your body into a different spot so that that person is more physically included in the group and what's happening, all of those things are useful tools that you should have, keeping in mind that especially when it's in a work situation or a professional situation, that it's probably like wildly embarrassing for that person, or not, depending on the group and whether or not you know each other really well. Let's say somebody was used, yeah.
Okay, sometimes too, I notice that it's not just maybe ignoring them, but if, I've been in a situation where I would say something and it would very quickly be passed over. Okay, now, back to men. I mean, I feel like that happens a lot. And
Yeah.
it's just like whatever I say is kind of insignificant.
Yeah, that's a
And then
microaggression.
I'm wondering, okay, is it sexist or is it just me personally? Because maybe what I'm saying is stupid. I mean, it brings back all that stuff.
Here's the thing, like a lot of the isms that people talk about, sexism, homophobia, racism, a lot of those things can be pretty subtle. Somebody can have really internalized those ideas and not explicitly think in their head, I'm going to try and be sexist right now. Like that might not be the thing that they're thinking in that moment, but it's what you're experiencing, and it's valid because it's what you are experiencing. It's really important in these kind of moments to recognize that the expert in what's happening is the person that it's happening to. It is not the responsibility of everybody else around them to analyze and decide whether or not what that person is feeling is valid. Right. So in that moment, I don't have a good example or a good answer for you. What I've done in the past is kind of what you were talking about, is just call it out. It really depends on the scenario, but for me, saying like, hey, I just said this and I'd really like to come back to it and have a conversation about it, and we kind of grazed over it. So using that phrase, we kind of grazed over it, like refocusing it.
I said, well, I just don't feel like I'm being heard. Oh, I'm so sensitive.
Yeah. Also, if it's a leadership thing about whatever group that you're in, asking the person who's leading the meeting after it's over or while it's happening, like say, this is what I'm experiencing, this is something that I'm noticing in our meetings, and it's really bothering me, and I want you to do something about it. Then it's in that person's court to make sure that it doesn't happen, and if it does keep happening, like maybe there's extra steps that you need to take. So what if somebody is using racial slurs around you? I think jokes are a really good example here. Like let's say somebody is making a racist joke about Native folks, and it's your dad. I know.
The tongue out probably is appropriate.
But call it low-life figure of white trash maybe isn't appropriate either. But I don't
No.
So you just say that's,
No, it's
I
not.
don't think that's funny. You can just kill it by saying, I don't think that's funny.
Yeah. Yeah. Whatever you do, like make sure that they know that you do not think it's funny. I think also when somebody's making blanket racial slurs, or when somebody's making a racist joke, saying like, why do you think that's funny? Is that not the most awkward thing that you've ever heard? Like, why do you think that that racist joke is funny? Because I'm racist. No, nobody's gonna say that, but it kind of calls them out on it and says like, this is not funny because it is racist. And it sort of refocuses the conversation into a conversation and away from something that's super aggressive. We don't have enough time for it this evening, but there's a lot of, if you want to talk about it later, feel free to email me or call me. There's a lot of great tools that folks can use for diverting conversations, particularly about racism with white friends, that recenters that conversation and asks people to really consider the implications of constantly using racial slurs, racial jokes. So if you want to talk about it, we can. But saying it's not funny, and also, what was the thing that I just said? Why do you think? Like, why do you think this is funny? Are two like really easy, great things to pull out of your toolbox and use when it's happening in the moment. So embed them.
So back to the body language thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like what I do is I put my head down on the table.
Yeah.
Perfect. I can't even believe that person said that.
Yeah.
And usually it's pretty effective.
Yeah, it is. I also find like if it's often family that this happens with, it's like those really uncomfortable, awkward conversations around the Thanksgiving table. Like that's a really great place to be like, I'm not okay with this. And like actually engage in a personal conversation and explaining like why that makes you feel uncomfortable, and then also really delving into the like, but why do you think that this is funny? Like, can we actually have a real conversation about why you think that this is funny? Yeah.
Micah, what happens when a Jewish guy tells or a woman for that matter, tells a joke about a Jewish American princess joke? Is that, if it's the same ethnic group, can they do it? Is that okay? Can you laugh then, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's up to, I think that's a really specific instance that you'd have to work through yourself. So as a gay person, lots of gay people like to make gay jokes.
Yeah, so what about
That's
that?
okay with my gay friends, because we're all on the same page about oppression. We're all on the same page about what homophobia actually is. But if...
So can a straight person laugh about the joke like that?
I don't want a straight person making jokes like that.
No,
Not at all.
no. A gay person makes a gay joke, right?
And a straight person laughs. You'd have to ask them.
Okay.
That's a really specific scenario. You'd have to ask them. And it's a good time to ask, like, yeah. Comedians,
We
yeah.
often give them leeway to be social commentarians about what's going on. I know, personally, comedians that I like, they talk a lot of social issues, like D.L. Hughley, for instance, will talk about a lot of things. And there's certain things that you can talk about being in the Black community that, someone outside of that community can't really speak on. But I think he makes a good point. Like, in the audience, you have a bunch of people who don't necessarily aren't in that group, but they understand the context. They understand where we are. We understand, okay, we're at a comedy show. Now, I'm not going to allow you to just say blatantly obscene things and offensive things, but if we're joking around, it's just a jest, and that's okay. But you bring up a good point. Like, it depends on the context.
It really does. It really does depend on the context, and the comedy show is a really great example of that too. There's a lot of really problematic comedians who are funny. If you're all in the same space, laughing about it together, that's like something between you and Jesus, if you believe in Jesus. But it's a really specific context, and if you have questions about it, I always think that the best thing to do if you're wondering about it is just to ask. Say like, hey, as a Jewish person, I'm not Jewish. Are you, can I laugh about this? And then that can honestly be even funnier sometimes. So yeah, did somebody else have a question? Did you have a question?
I got a thought. Both had this question, you're sitting in a circle with people who are talking racist jokes or comments or something like that, and the word context comes up. And one of the things that I'm thinking about as I look through all these different examples is the first step is into some kind of action. And I think one of the things that's really important is to step back to the balcony and kind of assess the situation. Because asking those questions about, do you think this is funny or why? Well, if you're the outsider, you're in group. It's kind of like, what the heck is this all about?
I mean, I think that makes it more important to ask in that moment too. I mean, because
But to be able to assess and develop context, I'm suggesting is to have the patience before intervening.
Yeah.
Take a moment and assess what's really going on.
Yeah.
So at least you have a feel before you get punched in the nose.
I think that that's a really great thought, particularly when it comes to comedy. In other situations, you may not have as much opportunity to assess before you intervene. When it comes to comedy and whether or not you're asking somebody whether or not they actually are believing the jokes that they're making, whether or not it is okay to be laughing at those jokes before you intervene in that kind of conversation, assessing the situation is great. But if somebody is being actively harassed next to you, and it was me, I wouldn't want somebody to stand there and assess the situation first. I would want them to just come over and help first. And then you can have a conversation with the person who's doing the harassing if they want. You don't agree? Why?
In any given situation, very hypothetical situation, it's a moment, and to assess the level of threat. Doesn't take very necessary, but it's kind of like knowing the different doors that open and close in any given situation.
Yeah.
In my experience, the idea of what I've been thinking about is to take that moment to go to the balcony, kind of assess the situation, because if you get any one of these situations, it can be very threatening. Any action can create a reaction as far as consequences of a lot of different things.
Yeah. That you bring up a great point, which is that the need to reassess situations is why we need to have conversations like this. Having tools in your toolbox allows you to confidently and knowledgeably answer moments of discrimination and not sit on the sidelines. Because my worry about that, and this has happened to me before, when harassment has happened, there's been someone that stood there and assessed too long. And oftentimes, it's not because they agreed with what was happening, it's because they didn't know what to do. So assess, absolutely assess. Determine whether or not a situation is violent. Determine whether or not you need to actually intervene in a situation. But I promise you, people are going to remember whether or not you intervene more than whether or not you thought about it. They will remember.
I'm not trying to create an artificial distance here, but to be able to say, yeah, we're getting tools tonight.
Yes.
Which tools work? And maybe before you jump in, take a moment, as they say, go to the balcony and assess, which says make your fact that your individual fact.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move on. Ableist annoyance. This is something that I think happens in Missoula a lot, particularly in winter months. People get really annoyed that they need to shovel their sidewalks. People get really annoyed about whether or not somebody is asking us to be handicap accessible. So let's say that you're in charge of an event and someone calls up and says, hey, is this event handicap accessible? And the person that called, that answered the phone is feeling really annoyed with being asked that question. This happens in Missoula a lot. There's a lot of spaces that people do community events at that are not handicap accessible. And more often than not, our reaction to those kind of questions is annoyance. Like, oh, this is another thing that I have to manage at the event. It's ableist and it's discriminatory. So what would you do in the event that somebody called, someone else answered, and they got off the phone and they're like, oh, I really don't want to take the time to make sure that this is handicap accessible. This is just another thing that's on my plate. What would you do in that moment?
I would basically tell them that could be you. That, you could be that person.
Yeah.
For all you know, there was a time when I wasn't handicapped, and now, not a lot, but a little bit because of my legs. So I said, that could be you. You don't know when you're going to fall, or you don't know what's going to happen to you. That could be you.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a little stereotypical American thing, suing, but we do have laws in America that they have to provide a service. So you can threaten them, I guess.
You could. Gently remind them of our responsibility as humans to respond. Yeah.
I think if you're a person who's like a community organizer where you're trying to have an event where you're trying to get a lot of people there, and someone shows a little bit of ableist annoyance, you can say, hey, we're trying to be inclusive of everyone, and having this handicap accessible means there can be a lot more people that are there. And I do agree with you, like in the winter months, Missoula it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to get around, and being in my role as the outreach coordinator for SARC and president of BSU, I always am making sure that at the events, okay, is it handicap accessible? Because hey, this is an issue that is important to everyone, not just able-bodied individuals. So
Yeah.
this is something that we really need to address, and if it's not, a lot of buildings at the university are not. We need to switch venues, or we need to switch areas to where everyone can attend. And like you said, there are laws against that, so hopefully it doesn't get to that point. You can just be a good person, be like, oh, I'm so sorry. We'll do something to address that, but it depends. It kind of depends on the role. So hopefully that person is not a person of power who makes the decisions.
Yeah. Ideally.
Yeah, ideally. So
I think you bring up.
Yeah, that's what I try to do.
I think you bring up two things that I heard that are really important, especially as folks who are in this room, that I'm sure a lot of us identify as progressive people, as liberal people, as people who like to think about whether or not we're including other folks in the things that we're doing, is to just stop that before it starts. To make sure that when we're planning events and that we're planning on doing things, that it is in a space that is handicap accessible, that at the start of your planning, you're reminding yourself to make sure that it's accessible. And then the second thing that you said that I heard too is, I'm sorry. Apologizing to people in any of these situations, if you're somebody who's making it worse, is super important. It's also really difficult. Like when the thing with Hodan this weekend happened, I had to apologize to her. Because she noticed that I didn't intervene, like that was my fault. being willing to say I'm sorry and like learn through mistakes is a huge piece to whether or not we're actually being inclusive and not just valuing diversity in name. And then the other thing too, if it really comes to it, you can remind them like we have laws and we need to abide by them, you know? Another thing that you can do too, organizationally as a group, is include it in your bylaws. A lot of groups do this about, especially in places like Montana that don't have non-discrimination ordinances. There's a lot of organizations that put it in their bylaws saying, we value diversity, we are a non-discriminatory organization that will not discriminate against you based on this, that, or the other. Including in your bylaws that when we're planning events, we plan to make sure that all of our spaces are handicap accessible is a really easy way to hold yourselves accountable through internal policy too. So a little urethral, but you can also add a lot of these things in. Let's move on. We don't have a lot of time here, but I do kind of want to talk about this, particularly this first one. Microaggressive moments are some of those smaller moments that we're talking about. It's not exactly like when somebody's yelling at another human on the bus, and it's not exactly when somebody is making a racial slur. It's somebody kind of apologizing for their own oppression or their own oppressiveness. In Montana, a lot, I hear from a lot of progressive people, from a lot of Democrats, myself, I've said this before, I'm colorblind. Can we talk about like why this is sort of microaggressive? Yeah.
I think it's just ignoring the historical context of just hurdles that certain groups have faced over the last 100 years, 200 years.
Yeah, yeah.
Colorblind implies that you only see things as black and white.
Yeah. What else? I know there's a million things that we can list why saying I'm colorblind is
It
problematic.
says that you're personally not racist, but it's not doing anything to stop it.
Yes. It doesn't actually help.
Right.
Not useful. It is not useful to not see color.
It's excusing yourself.
Yeah, it is. It does excuse us a lot too. And
Not true.
it is also a lie. Yes. Why? You want to expand on that? You want to expand on why it's a lie?
I mean, it's just like someone's race is a fact that I can't like pretend I don't see. Like it's just the truth.
And it kind of highlights your privilege as well, because if you're a person, I'm colorblind, well, that means you're only in spaces where individuals that look like you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll just comment on a personal experience real quick. And that
Yeah.
is that
Please do.
with my African American or Black friends, I forget that they're Black sometimes. And this was many, many years ago, and they taught me a whole bunch of stuff. And it was really awesome to hear their experiences and say, they actually told me, you can go there, but if I go there in the middle of the night and I'm not blah, 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 and they would give me scenarios, and it was like, okay, I get it. But it was a slogan, it took a long time to get it.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And it's kind of interesting that you bring up that scenario because something similar happened to me again with Hodan. Bless her for being so forgiving of me. I was talking about getting to the airport in Portland this weekend, and I just casually said, hey, y'all, do you know like when I should get to the airport to get through security and make it to my gate on time? And Hodan was like, well, I would need to get there 3 hours early. Every single time she goes through airport security, she is searched. And I like didn't even think about it in that moment that like the way that I walk through the world in that scenario is completely different from the way that Hodan walks through that scenario. And that is absolutely because of Islamophobia, and it's because of the color of her skin. Being colorblind in that scenario would totally negate that experience that she's having. This has also happened, people often say I don't see gender too. Not good. For the exact same reasons. It totally minimalizes somebody's individual experience of walking through the world as a woman or as a genderqueer person. And the things that they experience as a woman or as a genderqueer person. So, great conversation. We're gonna move on though so that we do have time for questions. There's a lot of other things that we could talk about, and if you do wanna talk about them later, again, I'm super open. Give me a call, we can have coffee. And I just kind of wanted to end with some ways that we can support folks who are experiencing oppression other than doing that thing where you're like actually intervening in the bus stop or waiting for a moment when a family member says something racist to intervene. There's a couple things that I think, and I'd love for us to like have a conversation about expanding these things after we go through it. The first thing that I would note is don't demand that every person who's from a minority tell you their story about what that means to them. Like, don't demand that every person that is Black, LGBTQ, Native, disabled, explain to you the ways that they have experienced oppression. Just believe them. Believe them that their experience walking through the world has been fundamentally different than yours, and that means that life may have been a little bit harder in some ways than you. The second thing is listen actively. If somebody does want to tell you their story or want to tell you their experience of what is happening to them, listen actively. Don't listen with the intent of responding immediately, just listen to what they have to say. The third thing that I would say is that we need to be really committed to anti-oppression work as the centerpiece of our work in addition to our personal lives. There's a lot of opportunity for us to think about how bystander intervention interplays with our work in addition to our personal lives. We didn't really have an opportunity to go through all of them tonight because we only have an hour and this could take a lifetime, right? But thinking about what it looks like to value inclusion over diversity, and that true diversity, truly valuing diversity means that you're handing power over to someone else or sharing power between the two of you. Also think about what it means to step up and step back. In spaces when you're making decisions with other folks, if you're somebody who often has the ability to say more than somebody else, think about ways that you can be inclusive of the other folks in the room and the other people that may be aggressively or non-aggressively removed from the situation. Other thing I would say too is that money talks. This is really important right now too. There's a lot of organizing that is happening because of what happened in the election. There was a lot of organizing that was happening before what happened in the election. And one of the best ways that we can support people who are doing work on behalf of their own communities is to give money. Couple groups that I identified and was thinking about some in Montana: Disability Rights Montana, Montana Human Rights Network, Racial Equity Project, the Montana Immigrant Justice Alliance, Soft Landing. What? This one?
No. Second from the front.
This one.
No.
This one.
First line, second.
Yeah, MHRN, Stop Planning Missoula, Western Native Voice, Indian Peoples Action, Native Generational Change, Black Lives Matter work. Planned Parenthood is a great example. Blue Mountain Clinic is another really great example too. If you really care about the work, one of the best ways to be heard as a person who may have more privilege than somebody else that's actually doing this work is to give money to them. Also answer calls to action. As somebody who may or may not be experiencing certain levels of oppression, blah, 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 whatever, answer when somebody asks you to show up. Get on email lists. If you really care about immigrant justice work in Montana, get on MIHA's mailing list. And when they ask you to show up to the Capitol or to make a call to one of our representatives on behalf of issues that is important to the immigrant community in Montana, do it. The last thing that I would say too is continually evaluate both yourself and your organizations. Like, continually be willing to learn and move forward as you learn new things. This is like anything in life. This is a continual learning process. Obviously, I had a lot of learning moments this weekend that helped me prepare for this presentation in particular too. But be ready and willing to learn through our mistakes as we try to pursue an anti-oppressive society, knowing that it's going to make the world better, not just for the people who are experiencing oppression, but for all of us. So, questions, thoughts, comments as we end this. I know that was super rushed and really short. I appreciate you being willing to have this conversation. So, any final closing thoughts?
How long of a presentation is this usually when you do it? Is it a whole day workshop, or what do you usually?
So I've led whole day workshops on this. It sort of depends on the group that you're in. I will say that this conversation that Roberta and I had was the result of a lot of the American Nazi Party literature that was distributed throughout Missoula. Montana Women Vote, Montana Human Rights Network, Forward Montana, Missoula Central Labor Council all came together and said, this isn't great, what can we do? And it was like a gut reaction to other people flyering, we decided to flyer also. And instead of saying like, here's a list of organizations that don't agree with him, we decided to say our community needs to know what to do when they see somebody being discriminated
That was
against.
a great flyer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that's what I passed out to you. It's a really quick and dirty way to stand up when you see violence and oppression happening. It definitely doesn't get into all of it, and it occasionally can raise more questions than it can answer. So if you want to have the conversation, I'm available and willing to have the conversation. So any final thoughts or questions? Yeah.
I've been learning about what white feminism is lately and kind of talking about it. I can't believe how many people don't understand it. And, like they don't get Black Lives Matter. That. So let's all try to figure that out.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up. Montana Women Vote was started with the idea of including low-income women in particular in the democratic process, knowing that often our elected officials have a tendency to make decisions on behalf of low-income communities, particularly women, when it comes to their reproductive health care, when it comes to the economics of what it means to be a poor person, and in a state that has little to no federal assistance for poor people. And there's been a lot of imagery that we've used in our history of the suffrage movement, and I was pretty embarrassingly shocked to learn just how racist the suffragette movement was when it was happening. A lot of those leaders intentionally excluded Black women from being part of the movement. And actually, like, Native folks had the last right to vote in this country, and it was absurdly long until they had the right to vote. So I'm glad that you bring that up. I think that if we identify as feminist, to understand what white feminism is and to constantly be like disrupting those moments is really important, particularly in a community that is a lot of white people. You know, it's not homogenous, we're not all white people, but it is a lot of white people. And like, I'm happy to hear that like somebody else is thinking about that too. I think that there were a lot of things in the election that played into that also. So, any final thoughts? Okay. Again, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your willingness to have the conversation. It's tough.